The previous tests Ventis had gone through made my body itch to try extreme speed, but I knew it was impossible just yet. My main element was fire, leaving little in terms of normal energy to work with. Instead, I tried something faster than quick attack, but more attuned to my nature. My feet turned blazing hot, and my breath billowed out in thick clouds in the cold air. Then, whoosh, I came to a stop just inches from a willow tree. Behind me, the dirt was blackened, and a few small fires slowly sputtered out. "Flame charge!" Ventis yelled gleefully from the ground, still unable to stand. "That was not as fast as extreme speed," Jolteon said, though his tail wagged enthusiastically. "Nice one, Fenn," Noctowl called from above, still casually juggling his rock. Ventis still didn't fully understand Pokémon speech, yet she seemed to grasp the reactions of the others. I did my best to translate through our mental link, but she needed less and less help these days. It reminded me of the anime, where trainers often understood their Pokémon instinctively. Maybe she was starting to get there. By late afternoon, all of us were exhausted. Noctowl was thrilled with his progress. Jolteon had managed to adapt my move into a volt tackle and had spent the entire day practicing it. Ventis, however, had been mostly sidelined. After unleashing 3 of her most devastating spells, she had completely drained herself of magic. She possessed a ridiculous amount of mana, which only highlighted how powerful those spells truly were. "I advise against using those spells whenever possible," I told Ventis. "They're undeniably powerful, but if you drain yourself dry in the middle of a battle, we could lose. It's better to conserve your strength and rely on less demanding spells when you can." "I agree," she replied weakly. "I feel like I've been starving for a week." She focused on putting one foot in front of the other, clearly hoping her jelly-like legs wouldn't give out beneath her. Seeing that, I made a decision. I scooped her up into a princess carry. "Hey!" she yelped in surprise. "Brax," I spoke aloud instead of through our link, giving her a wink before breaking into a sprint. Jolteon didn't need an invitation and immediately raced alongside us. Above, Noctowl let out an amused hoot and glided overhead. None of us noticed the trailing shadows, nor the small black dot circling high in the sky. Baron Eldrick, Malvor, and Viscount Ormond Trevai cradled their polished gemstones. The so-called Pokeballs were capable of storing Pokémon through powerful magic. The gems were a pale grey, with a faint shimmer swirling deep within their cores. "I still can't believe we got actual Pokeballs." Eldrick turned the gem over in his palms, unable to keep the excitement from his voice. It contained an Onix, an extremely useful rock-type Pokémon that was nearly impossible for a noble of his standing to obtain. "I've always wanted an Onix." Ormond simply leaned back in his chair. He had no intention of telling the Baron what he had received. The old fool was celebrating a mere rock type, while he had been entrusted with a Shelgon, a dragon type, a Pokémon that could one day evolve into a Salamence if properly trained. Compared to that, an Onix was little more than a novelty. "Let's focus on what we promised," Ormond said calmly. "I'd rather rule over a rich stretch of land under Jaushara than spend another decade bowing to Vermont's petty high lords." His voice remained elegant and measured, yet venom lingered beneath every word. "Indeed, to our future." The Baron grinned and raised his glass of wine. Ormond VF returned the gesture. They parted ways several hours later, each returning to his own lands with plans already set in motion. Agents would be placed, supplies redirected, and loyalties quietly tested. Neither man intended to wait until war was officially declared. When the time came, they would weaken Vermont from within and allow Zhao Shara's armies to pass through their territories unhindered. For now, however, the war remained a distant prospect, a seed planted in secret. One that both men intended to nurture until it grew into something far deadlier. Count Alderic Ivelna stood upon a marble balcony overlooking the heart of the capital. Below him, the city of Azurport shimmered beneath the gentle warmth of early spring. The capital had been built where 3 great rivers met, before flowing into the sea, and water seemed present in every corner. Canals cut through districts lined with white stone buildings. Arched bridges crossed glittering waterways, while blue banners bearing Vermont's silver wave snapped in the breeze. Today, however, Even the capital surpassed itself. Flower garlands hung from windows. Colored ribbons stretched between rooftops. Musicians played cheerful melodies from every square, while merchants sold sweet pastries, roasted fish, and candied berries to the crowds filling the streets. The Spring Awakening Festival, one of Vermont's oldest celebrations. Normally Alderic enjoyed it. This year he wanted nothing more than to leave. 3 months. 3 months of galas, banquets, meetings, receptions, noble dinners, political dinners, and dinners disguised as political meetings. He had smiled so much that his cheeks hurt. His gaze drifted toward the massive lake occupying the center of Azureport. Thousands of citizens crowded its shores. The performance had already begun. A line of lapras glided across the water in perfect formation while riders dressed in ceremonial blue cloaks stood proudly upon their backs. Behind them, dozens of Goldine and Sea King leaped from the lake, scales glittering like living jewels beneath the afternoon sun. The crowd erupted into applause. Alderic managed a polite smile. A moment later, jets of water shot skyward. Several war turtles standing upon floating platforms unleashed synchronized water guns, creating enormous arches that crossed high above the lake. Children pointed excitedly, while adults cheered. Then came the main attraction. A pair of dugongs burst from the water. The lake exploded into foam. Gasps spread through the crowd. The elegant, shimmering white Pokémon twisted through the air before crashing back into the water with a burst of colorful bubbles. The audience loved it. Alderic merely wished he were home. Father. Alderic glanced sideways. Esther stood beside him, wearing a sky-blue Vaporeon-themed dress, chosen specifically for the festival. The color complemented her hair perfectly, or so at least 12 noblewomen had informed her. I know that look. What look? The one where you'd rather be anywhere else. Alderic snorted. Your observational skills continue to improve. They aren't difficult observations. Esther folded her arms. You hate the capital? I do not hate the capital. You hate the nobles. That is a completely different statement. His daughter actually laughed. Alderic allowed himself a small smile. At least Esther seemed happier than she had been when they first arrived. The girl's jealousy regarding Ventis had not vanished entirely, but distance had softened it somewhat. Not enough, unfortunately. His gaze drifted toward the royal pavilion overlooking the lake. King Callister stood upon an elevated platform, draped in blue silk. The ruler of Vermont appeared every bit the beloved monarch the people imagined him to be. He smiled warmly and waved toward the crowd. To his right stood Crown Prince Lucien, tall, handsome, and utterly forgettable. To the king's left stood Prince Augustine. The younger prince wore the same pleasant smile as his father. Alderic trusted that smile far less. Even from this distance, Augustine appeared attentive, less interested in the show and more the line of nobles. As though sensing the scrutiny, Augustine briefly looked in Alderic's direction. The count immediately inclined his head. The prince returned a polite nod. Then his attention shifted elsewhere. Alderic exhaled slowly. One day that young man would become either Vermont's greatest asset or its greatest danger. Perhaps both. Trumpets suddenly sounded across the lake. The next act was beginning. A squadron of trained Pelipper soared overhead while dozens of Wingull followed behind. The Pokémon released flower petals gathered from baskets strapped to their backs. Pink and white blossoms drifted across the city like spring snow, and the crowd cheered. I also hate that I have to be here, Master Pelien sighed. I'd much rather see how my pupil is doing. She is fine. Alderic adjusted the bracer on his arm. Haunter's collar is still active, and he's watching over them. That isn't particularly reassuring. Pelien's words were little more than a murmur as she gently stroked the soft fur of her ninetails. The past few months had been exhausting. Her savings had grown to a frankly frightening amount, and she had been required to attend no fewer than 6 gatherings of senior mages. On top of that, she had held several discussions with Archmage Gehatu regarding the newly discovered Eevee evolutions. The evolution of her own Vulpix into a Ninetales had only intensified the attention. More than a few of her peers had looked at her with poorly hidden envy. Yet Peliene found herself caring very little about the fame suddenly attached to her name. mostly because she felt she didn't deserve it. Nearly every achievement for which she was being praised truly belonged to Ventis. The young girl had been responsible for so much of it, but Peliene's lips remained sealed. King Callister himself had arranged a private conversation with her and ensured her cooperation with a reward large enough to make most nobles blink twice. Not mere gold shillings, gold royals, each coin worth 10 times as much as the smaller gold pieces used throughout the kingdom. The king's message had been polite. The meaning behind it had not. During her final days in the capital, Peliene had spent much of her time collecting the items she had commissioned for Ventis. A mage outfit woven with elemental-resistant materials, intentionally tailored slightly larger to accommodate the girl's continued growth. A set of enchanted rings designed to amplify magical output. And a carefully selected spellbook containing many of the spells expected from a mage seeking higher rank certification. The gifts had cost a small fortune. She would have gladly spent twice as much. Peliene was still uncertain whether Ventis would eventually be allowed to attend the Royal Magic Academy. Officially, the institution primarily accepted students from noble families and established magical lineages. Ventis possessed neither. Then again, King Callister was likely to bend the rules for the girl. The thought was both comforting and worrying. In the end, there was little Peliene could do. The road ahead would be difficult no matter what happened. All she could do was smooth that road where she could, offer guidance when needed, and hope that the extraordinary girl waiting back at Evelna Manor would find her own way forward. Spring arrived not with a gentle breeze, but with a storm. It was an immensely powerful one, impressive even by modern standards. Several peasants were forced to flee to the city after the wind literally tore the heavy straw roofs from their homes. Rain fell in relentless sheets, each drop striking with enough force to sting exposed skin. Outside, the world had become a blur of grey water and howling wind. Ventis was stuck inside with us. The storm showed no signs of ending. "I am going out," I stated grimly, removing my hat and bows. "What?" both Ventis and the others exclaimed. "I need some training against water types, and this feels like the perfect opportunity." I spoke through our mental link while repeating myself aloud in Pokémon speech. Ventis maintained the connection despite what she was about to experience. My pain. For a human, the rain would have been miserable. For me, it felt like being pelted by hundreds of paintballs every second without any protection. Each impact stung against my fur and skin. I gritted my teeth and endured it, sitting down outside in a lotus position as the storm battered me from every direction. The rain soaked through my fur almost instantly. The cold followed soon after. Then a familiar yellow shape appeared beside me. "I will not let you suffer alone." Jolteon sat down at my side. I could barely keep my eyes open enough to look at him. The rain hammered against his fur as well, yet he remained where he was. For nearly 10 minutes, I endured the punishment. Then a hand grabbed me by the scruff. Before I could protest, I was dragged back under cover. "You are going to get sick," Ventis stated firmly. She shivered as she spoke, not from the cold, but from the pain transmitted through our link. Agreed. I nodded slowly, though even that small motion hurt. "Let's make a hot bath." The moment the words left my mouth, everything went black. When I came to, the first thing I noticed was warmth. The second was the smell of burning firewood from the nearby hearth. The third was a brush moving gently through my fur. I blinked my eyes open. Ventis sat beside me, carefully combing out the damp tangles. Nearby, Jolteon slept on his back with all 4 legs sticking straight into the air, looking like a startled sheep that had forgotten how gravity worked. A small smile tugged at my lips. "That was dumb and brave," I said softly to Ventis. "You didn't need to feel my pain." "Of course I did." She continued brushing my ear fluff with careful strokes. "Do you think I'll be able to avoid that later? Better to build up some experience now than get stunned when it really matters." I let out a quiet chuckle. "We're one idiot couple, huh?" Ventis simply nodded. "Hoot." Noctowl shook his head from his perch, making it very clear what he thought of our decision-making skills. "I'll be less reckless, I promise." The owl's unimpressed stare suggested he didn't believe me for a second. Outside, the raging torrent had softened into a steady drizzle, though the rain still refused to stop completely. Water continued to patter against the windows and roof in a soothing rhythm. I took a deep breath. The scent of rain filled my nose. As a human, I had always loved that smell. As a Pokémon, with senses far sharper than before, I loved it even more. Only a day after the storm passed, the Count and his delegation finally returned home. His Aggron lumbered straight into its old stall, looking thoroughly pleased to be back. Machamp immediately set to work, unloading the heavier luggage, carrying entire trunks as if they weighed nothing. Umbreon, meanwhile, calmly padded alongside Count Alderic as he headed deeper into the manor. Esther and her Pokémon wasted no time at all, practically sprinting toward her wing of the estate. Master Peliene and her Pokémon were carrying a considerable number of boxes as well, making their way toward the mage wing. Deciding to help, I grabbed one of the packages from Peliene. "Is Ventis here?" she asked. Braxian." I nodded while hoisting what turned out to be a shockingly heavy suitcase. By the time I set it down in her office, I was seriously questioning what she had packed inside. Peliene reached into one of her pockets and produced a red biscuit-like treat, offering it to me. I happily accepted. The moment I bit into it, my mouth exploded with heat. Delicious. "Please call for Ventis." "I brought her a few things," Peliene said kindly. I nodded and immediately reached through our bond. "Ventis! Wake up! Peliene is here and wants to see you." The mental shout was loud enough that Ventis practically fell out of bed. A sharp sting shot through my elbow as she smacked her funny bone on the way down. "Coming!" she groaned through the link. I raised a hand and gave Peliene a thumbs up. The Master Mage chuckled. "I wish I were brave enough to make a bond," she said with a sigh. Honestly, it was strange that she hadn't tried. Ninetales adored her. No, adored was too weak a word. The fox practically worshipped the ground Peliene walked on. I tapped the woman on the shoulder and pointed toward Ninetales. "You think she and I are capable?" Peliene asked. I simply rolled my eyes. Walking over to Ninetales, I unclipped the fox's collar without even asking permission and grinned. "What?" Peliene raised an eyebrow. The moment the collar came off, Ninetales launched herself forward. Peliene barely had time to react before a fluffy, fox-shaped missile collided with her chest. The next few seconds consisted almost entirely of frantic licking. "Wait! I can't!" Slurp. "I get your point." Laughing despite herself, Peliene finally managed to push the overly affectionate Ninetales back. The fox's tail swished furiously behind her. "Then I shall try," Peliene said, still smiling as she straightened her robes. "After Ventis gets here." Ninetales barked happily and immediately pressed herself against Peliene's side again. I merely gave the Master Mage a look. See? Not exactly subtle. "Master," she smiled as she entered the room. "It's good to see you." "And it's good to see you too, Ventis." Peliene returned the smile warmly. "Come, I brought you some gifts." Ventis looked toward the table where 3 boxes rested. "Gifts?" Her eyes widened instantly, as if the drowsiness had been chased away by magic. She took a few hesitant steps forward, but only I could hear the storm of thoughts running through her mind through our bond. Emotions, memories, gratitude, and uncertainty all mixed together. She had received gifts before. The prince had given her valuable things, but both of us knew those were, in a way, investments. Rewards meant to secure loyalty. This was different. There were no expectations here. No politics. Just kindness. I felt my own eyes begin to sting and quickly turned away to wipe them before anyone noticed. Without saying a word, Ventis stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Peliene. The grown woman froze for a moment before hugging her back. I noticed Peliene suddenly becoming very interested in looking toward the window, suspiciously mimicking what I had done moments earlier. "Go on then," she said softly after a few seconds, gently nudging Ventis toward the table. "See what I brought." Ventis nodded and approached the gifts. The first box was the largest. Inside lay a marvelous blue and purple mage dress. Even before touching it, one could tell it was magical. The runes embroidered along the hems and edges slowly shifted and moved, flowing through the fabric like tiny streams of light. It was also slightly larger than Ventis's current size, clearly made with room for her to grow. The next gift was a tome nearly as large as Ventis's chest. The heavy book was bound in dark leather and secured with a polished silver clasp. It looked less like an apprentice's textbook and more like something a proper mage would proudly keep on their shelf. The final box contained 2 rings. They were made of gold and appeared almost plain at first glance, lacking gemstones or extravagant decorations, yet the moment Ventis slipped them onto her fingers, I felt the magic contained within them through our bond. The enchantments were powerful. Ventis stared at the gifts before looking back at Peliene. I don't know what to say. What you and Fenn did for me, and for this kingdom really, Peliene smiled gently. This is only a small thing in comparison. I just hope they will help you in the future. Ventis looked down at the gifts once more. The dress, the spellbook, the rings. Then she looked back at her teacher. Thank you, Master. Her voice was quiet, but the emotions behind it were not. Peliene simply smiled and rested a hand on her shoulder. You're welcome, Ventis. Beside her, Ninetails let out a happy bark and leaned against her trainer's leg, while I quietly rubbed at my eyes again and pretended I had gotten something in them. Alderic finally managed to retreat to his office and lock the door behind him. Haunter! The moment he called, black miasma began pooling across the floor. Tongues and floating eyeballs blinked into existence within the darkness, and the room grew noticeably colder. I have no time for your silly shenanigans, the Count said as he loosened his collar. Report! Haunter slowly rose from the floor with a sour expression. He had clearly been looking forward to teasing his master after being left behind for nearly 3 months. Unfortunately, the collar around his neck had other ideas. With a dramatic sigh, the ghost type floated forward. Alderic settled comfortably into his chair. Only then did Haunter act. The Pokemon's eyes glowed. Hypnosis! The Count's vision blurred, and a moment later, darkness claimed him. Haunter immediately followed with another ability. Dreams twisted. Images formed. The ghost carefully replayed everything he had witnessed during the winter. The manner, the training, the lessons, the experiments, and, perhaps most importantly, the many occasions when Ventis and her Pokémon thought they were being sneaky. To Haunter's immense amusement, they had not been nearly as subtle as they believed. When Alderic awoke, his eyes snapped open. Sweat immediately began to bead across his forehead. Not because of Haunter's abilities. No, because of what he had seen. Ventis's final 3 spells alone were enough to make his stomach twist. Each one possessed power comparable to that of a royal combat wizard who had trained for decades. The fact that she had managed to cast 3 different spells of that magnitude before nearly collapsing was somehow even more terrifying. Alderic slowly rubbed his face. The girl was not merely talented, not merely gifted, not even merely a future Archmage candidate. No, she was already reaching toward that level. The realization sent a shiver through him. Archmages rarely left their chosen cities. Most never participated directly in wars either. Instead, they acted as living shields, protecting the great population centers they called home. It was one of the primary reasons none of the neighboring kingdoms had managed to conquer one another outright. No king wished to march an army toward a city defended by an archmage. Such campaigns tended to end badly. Very badly. Yet Ventis was still little more than a teenager. A teenager. Alderic suddenly felt the need for a drink. The dream had shown him something else as well. There had been countless conversations between Ventis and her Brycon through their mental bond. Haunter had faithfully recreated everything he could perceive, but even he couldn't hear what passed through that link. The pair frequently exchanged information, theories, and strange words that Alderic had never heard before. The Count had no idea what half of it meant, and that bothered him quite a lot. You did well. Haunter immediately brightened. I'll double next month's sweets. The ghost type's eyes practically sparkled. He spun happily through the air before phasing straight through the nearest wall in his excitement. Alderic watched him leave before releasing a long sigh. I wonder how much His Majesty truly knows. The thought lingered. King Callister undoubtedly possessed better spies than he did, far better. If Alderic could learn this much through a single Haunter, what had the king discovered? The answer was probably something he did not want to hear. The Count rose from his chair and walked to a seemingly ordinary bookcase. A hidden compartment clicked open. Inside sat his private liquor cabinet. After pouring himself a perfectly reasonable amount, which was admittedly more generous than usual, he returned to his desk. His gaze settled upon the portrait hanging on the opposite wall. Bella, his late wife, smiled back at him exactly as she had years ago. For a long moment, he simply stared. Then he lifted his glass. "Don't judge me, Bella." Alderic allowed himself a tired, crooked smile. "I need this one." For some reason, the painted woman looked thoroughly unconvinced. Semil Cavellis, warmage and confidant of Archmage Gehatu, heard his father laugh. His father? The impossibly strict Gehatu Cavellis. Laughing. Semil could not imagine what could make the old coffin dodger laugh this hard, but he figured he would not test his luck. Instead, he quietly turned around and walked back down the same stairs he had come up. Whatever was happening up there was none of his business. Gehatu was happy. Oh, so very happy. He had finally found someone worthy of his teaching. The young girl called Ventis wasn't some unpolished gem waiting to be cut. She was already a gleaming amethyst of pure potential. Under his tutelage, the girl was sure to soar and reach, nay, pass him in skill, talent, and power. "I want her. I need her," he croaked, his voice hoarse from laughter. The old archmage walked to the magically locked safe in his tower and spent almost a full minute unlocking all the protections. Runes faded one after another, hidden mechanisms clicked, and finally the 5-inch thick steel door slowly swung open. Inside sat all 7 of the crystal Pokeballs he owned. His collection. His treasures. One of them held a Pokémon he never really used. He had only caught it because it was causing trouble, and since he had no need for an empty crystal ball, he simply kept the creature sealed away. Inside the crystals, time itself paused. Pokémon stored within neither aged nor hungered. It was little wonder a single crystal ball could cost as much as a mana, not to mention how rare it was to find crystal pure enough to craft one in the first place. Gehatu's eyes settled on one particular sphere, a Primarina, a nasty one at that, with a truly dreadful personality. She had nearly sunk a boat carrying King Callister years ago. Not that His Majesty had ever been in any real danger, but still. Attempting to drown the king was generally frowned upon. "You will be the perfect gift," Gehatu giggled, lifting the crystal from its stand, as well as a test for Ventis. The thought only made him grin wider. If the girl truly was everything he suspected, she would tame the troublesome Primarina. If not, well, that would be useful information too. Still chuckling to himself, Gehatu summoned an ornate box and carefully packed the crystal Pokeball inside. Not too far from the Mage Tower, in the palace gardens, King Callister Vermont was sharing a snack with his Empoleon. Several opened letters lay scattered across the table before him, some covered in notes written in his own hand. "I guess today you don't want to play chess." Augustine settled into the chair opposite him. "Maybe later. I have troubling news from my spies overseeing Junior Mage Ventis." Callister's strict tone immediately put Augustine on edge. The king was many things, but grim was rarely one of them. Most days he carried a smile and enough good humor to fill a banquet hall. Seeing him without either was unsettling. "Did she get hurt? Or maybe one of her Pokémon?" Augustine asked. "No." Callister folded his hands. "But I think I will need to speed up my intervention if we do not want to lose her." During the winter, her skill and power soared like a Pidgeot. The king leaned forward. "I will arrange a marriage for her so she can join the Royal Magic Academy alongside you. She will likely attract attention from other noble sons and daughters, and not all of it will be friendly. Stay by her as a good friend and act if you have to. You don't need to tell me twice," Augustine smirked. Then his expression became more thoughtful. "Will she be able to fit in? I mean, she is lesser born." "That is not important." Callister gently fed another cookie to his Empoleon, who happily accepted the treat and crunched it with obvious satisfaction. "If anything, perhaps we can use that. Let the houses already opposing me look down on her. Let them think she is merely a lucky country bumpkin who somehow caught the attention of the 6th son of a marquis." "Robert?" Augustine scoffed. "Why him? There are far better young nobles you could marry her to." He is perfect for the role. Callister sounded entirely unconcerned. Good family, respectable reputation, and low enough in the succession line that nobody will make a fuss. A sixth son is unlikely to inherit much on his own. Marrying a promising mage of humble origins is far less jarring than pairing her with an heir. The king paused before raising an eyebrow. Besides, I thought you were his friend. Well, yes. Augustin awkwardly scratched the back of his head. He is a bit special, is all. Callister's iron stare lingered on his son. For a moment, the garden fell silent, except for the sound of Empoleon happily working through another cookie. Then understanding slowly dawned on the king's face. His stern expression cracked. Surprise appeared first, then amusement. A long chuckle escaped him. Oh? The single word made Augustine's face heat up immediately. Oh? The prince replied defensively. Oh, indeed. The king leaned back in his chair, looking far more cheerful than he had a minute earlier. Empoleon glanced between the two humans, completely lost as to what was happening, but happy enough as long as the cookies kept coming. So, I presume you trained while I was away? Umbreon casually walked into the small courtyard, meant for mages. He barely broke his stride when he spotted Noctowl, though I could tell from the slight twitch of his ears that he was surprised. We did some. I casually spoke while flipping my witch hat back onto my head. Jolteon scoffed and let out a small laugh. A little, he murmured. The capital was dull, with no way for me to vent some steam, so I hope you three can entertain me. Umbreon stopped on the opposite side of the courtyard with a smirk. I will start. Noctowl flared his wings. His deeper voice, after evolving, made him sound much more serious than before. Alone? Umbreon raised an eyebrow. Please. I would not underestimate him. Jolteon rushed to the middle line, his tail standing upright like a lightning rod. I'll let you be the judge, Jolteon. I hopped up onto the balcony overlooking the courtyard. Ventis! I shouted through our link. Show time! A few moments later, both Ventis and Peliene stepped outside and leaned over the railing. I believe in you, Noctowl! Ventis shouted. Noctowl's chest puffed out proudly. The moment Jolteon signaled the start of the fight, both Umbreon and Noctowl vanished. The field seemed empty. Then a cloud of smoke burst apart. Umbreon appeared in mid-jump and twisted his body as Noctowl's attack from above narrowly missed him. You weren't kidding, Umbreon admitted as he landed awkwardly. Less talking, more fighting. Noctowl's hoot echoed through the courtyard as he unleashed a sand attack. For the first part of the battle, Noctowl seemed completely dominant. He attacked relentlessly from above, never staying in one place long enough for Umbreon to counter. Then, zazap. A thunder wave suddenly caged him. Umbreon appeared directly beneath the owl Pokémon. Noctowl froze mid-flight as paralysis coursed through his body. A moment later, Umbreon fired a powerful Shadow Ball point blank. The attack struck cleanly. Noctowl was blasted backward. He hit the ground hard. The owl had already been breathing heavily from the effort of maintaining such a fast pace. The Shadow Ball was enough to finish the match. Noctowl is out! Jolteon shouted before rushing to his friend's side. He nudged the unconscious owl with his nose. After a moment, he let out a relieved sigh. He'll be all right. Umbreon rolled his shoulders and shook some dust from his fur. Not bad. Go next. I jumped down from the balcony. I'll be the judge. Taking a position on the side of the field, I pointed my wand toward the center. Sure. Jolteon grinned like an absolute fool. This was exactly the sort of thing he dreamed about. For his part, Umbreon no longer looked relaxed. The easy confidence was gone. He had seen enough. We were no longer the same Pokémon he had left behind before winter. His face settled into pure focus. The courtyard grew quiet. Even Ventis leaned forward. Go! I fired a small fireball from my wand. The glowing projectile shot into the sky and burst overhead, marking the start of the second battle. Jolteon was pure speed. Umbreon, who was also a speed demon in his own right, eagerly accepted the challenge. The fight became a blur. Even with my Pokémon eyes, I could barely keep up. Jolteon was like a bullet coated in lightning, while Umbreon moved like oil and smoke. Every time it looked like he was about to be hit, he either dodged at the last second or dissolved into a puff of darkness. Then I saw it. A hit. A solid hit. Jolteon slammed straight into Umbreon's ribs. Not with some ordinary quick attack. This was Volt Tackle. Lightning exploded across Umbreon's body and clung to him like living chains. Much to our dismay, Umbreon managed to move even while paralyzed. The sheer mental strength and effort it must have taken to force his body to obey made me flinch. Still, his speed wasn't the same anymore. Instead of focusing entirely on dodging, he began relying on powerful attacks to keep Jolteon at bay. The fight lasted barely 2 minutes. For those of us watching, it might as well have been an hour. I don't think any of us remembered to breathe. Jolteon managed to land 2 more serious hits. Then the paralysis wore off. Umbreon's eyes sharpened. Foul play. My stomach dropped. Sadly, it was the perfect move against Jolteon. He had spent the entire winter focusing on strength, speed, and explosive power. Foul play turned all of that against him. The attack landed with such speed and menace that I actually felt scared for him. "Jolteon is out!" I shouted while casting a light screen in front of him so Umbreon wouldn't accidentally kill the idiot. "I can. Still fight." Jolteon managed to raise his head. "No, you don't, dummy." I immediately started petting his head. "Rest now." Jolteon grumbled something under his breath, but didn't try to stand again. Across the courtyard, Umbreon wasn't looking much better. His breathing was heavier than before, and several patches of fur were still crackling with leftover static. "I will not fight you like this." I shook my head while looking at the battle-worn Pokémon. "It wouldn't be fair." Umbreon let out a long sigh and relaxed slightly. "I was actually thinking you might use this opportunity to knock me out." A smirk appeared on his face. "Take advantage of it." "Huh, like I need you to be tired after 2 whole battles to send you into the dirt." I said it with all the confidence I could muster. I was not at all sure I could actually do it. Umbreon was just that far ahead of us. "Ventis, we need the salves." I sent through our mental link. On the balcony, Pellienne slowly shook her head. Amazing. She had already been delighted to learn that Ventis's Hoot Hoot had evolved. That alone would have been enough to make most trainers proud. But now she had watched 2 of Ventis's Pokémon push a war veteran like Umbreon into such a state. One had nearly overwhelmed him through relentless pressure. The other had forced him to fight through paralysis and take multiple direct hits. For Pokémon that should have still been considered juniors, it was astonishing, and perhaps a little frightening. "That was cheap!" shouted Noctowl as he woke, only to realize he was in his nest. "Oh." He blinked a few times. "Did you guys win?" he asked, looking down and seeing Jolteon covered in bandages. "I guess not." "Almost." Jolteon smirked. "I got him good several times. I tell you, his skin is like iron." "Fenn?" asked Noctowl. "I did not fight him. He was too hurt and tired. It wouldn't have meant anything." I spoke casually from my cot while continuing to scribble on the scroll balanced across my lap. "Well, you should have." Jolteon frowned. "He needs to eat dirt at least once." "Oh, he will." I casually held the pen in one hand and the scroll in the other as I wrote. "Since when can you write?" he asked. "Since I have thumbs," I answered, puzzled. "How did you expect I ordered stuff from the smithy or the seamstress?" "Huh, that actually makes sense." Jolteon tilted his head. "Why haven't I seen you write before?" Noctowl asked this time. "I did it when I was alone." I shrugged. "Look, it's not like it's a big deal. I can read, so why couldn't I write?" I asked with a raised eyebrow. "Since you are a Pokémon," answered both of them in tandem. I stared at them. They stared back. For several seconds, nobody said anything. "Oh, for the love of Arceus, it's not a big deal." I rolled my eyes and set the pen down for a moment. Then a thought occurred to me. "Why? Do you want to learn how to read?" I asked casually. "Yes." The answer was so loud that I nearly dropped the scroll. Noctowl leaned so far out of his nest that I was afraid he would fall, while Jolteon somehow managed to sit upright despite all the bandages wrapped around him. I simply stared at the 2 of them. Apparently, this was a much bigger deal than I thought. Ventis was in the library at this time, learning about healing magic. Apparently, there were spells designed to patch up Pokémon faster and more reliably than just potions or salves. She had gotten the idea from Peliene when the Master Mage patched up Jolteon after the battle. Why didn't you use healing magic when we were at the mountain? Fenn was really hurt. Ventis sounded more curious than angry as she looked up from her book. Because I cannot. Peliene shook her head. I told you that healing magic exists, not that I know how to use it. Healing magic is not like elemental magic. You are either capable of it or not. It doesn't even use magic circles. It's more based on feelings and intuition. The Master Mage turned a page in her own book. I only know a handful of mages who ever learned healing magic. Ventis turned slightly pink and grinned. So you believe I am such a person? Well, it's worth a try, Peliene chuckled. You have surprised me more times than I would like to admit. She leaned back in her chair and continued reading her book on herbs. The cover was worn, the corners bent, and several pages had clearly been repaired over the years. Despite having access to far newer books, Peliene always seemed to return to this one. Ventis returned her attention to the healing magic booklet, or at least she tried to. The text was esoteric at best, and chicken scratch at worst. Who in their right mind writes like this? Asked Ventis, frowning as she squinted at a particularly ugly line of text. It was written by Archmage Zolnaria about 100 years ago, Peliene chuckled. Those who copy books reproduce them perfectly, right down to the ink splotches and mistakes. Some copies are easier to read than others. She tapped the side of her own book. I tried to write my research with clean letters specifically to avoid this. Ventis sighed. That explained absolutely nothing about why Archmage Zolnaria appeared to have been fighting the paper while writing. For nearly 2 hours, she struggled through the ramblings of a once great archmage. Nothing made sense. At least, nothing from the parts she could actually read. Several passages looked less like writing, and more like a drunken Ariados had crawled through a puddle of ink. Let's see how you react to this, smarty pants. Ventis giggled to herself as she finally closed the booklet and set it aside. The next victim of Archmage Zolnaria's handwriting would be a certain Firefox. The next morning, I was called to the special combat arena reserved for the Count's personal use. Umbreon was already waiting in the center of the sandy field, calm as ever. What I did not expect, however, was to find Alderic sitting in the viewing stand. The Count looked far more interested than any noble had a right to be this early in the morning. So, the Count wants to see us fight? I asked casually while tossing my hat onto a nearby chair so it wouldn't get damaged. He very much would indeed, Umbreon replied with a nod. Do not let my presence worry you, Brakeson. Sorry, Fenn. Alderic leaned back comfortably in his seat. Consider me an interested spectator. You ready? Umbreon asked. The question brought back a memory of the first time he had asked me that. Back then, I had been a Fennekin standing at the edge of the forest, small enough that he could have flattened me with a careless tackle. I had talent, determination, and exactly zero idea what I was doing. Now? Actually, yes, I am. I drew my wand and settled into a battle stance. Alderic rose from his chair, unsheathed his sword, and raised it overhead. The polished blade gleamed briefly in the morning sunlight before he slashed it downward. Go! Unlike before, I didn't rush. Instead, I conjured several light screens behind me and began feeding energy into the fire building within my body. Heat gathered in my chest and spread through my limbs while I waited for Umbreon's opening move. Sure enough, his favorite trick arrived almost immediately. Something struck the barrier behind me. I didn't even need to turn around. You are starting to become predictable. The thought stayed firmly inside my head. Talking during a battle was for people who wanted to get punched. Umbreon moved. One moment he was several paces away. The next, his teeth were clamping down on my tail. Or, at least, they should have been. A loud poof echoed across the arena. Umbreon's eyes widened. The tail vanished, leaving behind nothing but a Pokédoll. Substitute? The disbelief in his voice was almost worth the effort. Almost. Boom! I whispered the word from just above him as I released a fire blast. The explosion engulfed Umbreon and lit up half the arena. Flames rolled outward in a wave that forced even me to shield my face. The blast threw me backward as well, but I landed on all fours, and immediately searched for my opponent. Unfortunately, Umbreon specialized in being difficult to kill. His defenses were absurd, his endurance was absurd, even his speed was absurd. Frankly, whoever designed dark types deserved to step barefoot on a Lego. I scanned the smoke. Nothing. Then pain exploded across the back of my head. Payback. The fully powered attack struck like a runaway cart. The world spun and I rolled across the dirt, instinctively turning the tumble into extra distance. Every muscle screamed in protest as I finally dug my paws into the ground and stopped. It hurt, O Arceus above, it hurt. Yet the pain did something unexpected. It burned away every distraction. The mana vanished. The nobles vanished. The future vanished. Even my usual stream of sarcasm dried up. There was only the arena, only Umbreon. The sounds around me sharpened until I could hear every scrape of claw against dirt. My heartbeat thundered in my ears while the fire inside me roared brighter than ever before. I was not some meager Pokémon. I carried Ventis's power just as she carried mine. The moment my paws found solid footing, I launched myself forward. Flame charge. The attack slammed into Umbreon and pushed him back a step. Not enough. Again and again. Flame charge. The world began to blur around me. Umbreon dodged when he could and blocked when he couldn't. A sucker punch caught me hard enough to make my vision swim, yet I barely noticed it. Faster, faster. Just a little faster. Then it happened. The sensation I had been chasing for months suddenly clicked into place. Something inside me understood. Extreme speed. The world slowed. Umbreon's eyes widened. For the first time since this fight began, he looked genuinely shocked. Then I hit him. The impact sounded like a cannon firing. Umbreon left the ground entirely before crashing into the arena wall hard enough to crack the stone behind him. I felt the collision through my own body and staggered several steps, dizziness threatening to knock me over. Still, I remained standing, expecting him to get back up. He always got back up. This time he didn't. Silence settled over the arena. Then Alderic rose from his seat. Bracian wins! I stared, then stared a little longer. Only after several seconds did the words truly register. I had won. Against Umbreon. A slow grin spread across my muzzle. Well, that certainly felt good. With the adrenaline subsiding, I started to feel more and more dizzy. I literally had to clasp a paw over my mouth to stop myself from hurling up my Pokéshow. The Pecha berry-sized bump on the back of my head pulsed like an angry curse, while the sucker punch that had caught my left arm had very likely cracked a bone. These weren't love taps. These were proper battle wounds. Fenn. I felt Ventis through our link. She had clearly opened it wide and immediately gotten a taste of my misery. I'll live. I grinned despite everything. Also, I beat Umbreon in a one-on-one. The feeling that came through the bond was a strange mixture of pride, relief, and concern. I signaled to the Count that I was leaving. Alderic simply nodded before turning his attention to Umbreon. His partner was sitting against the arena wall looking annoyed, sore, and perhaps just a little embarrassed. My muscles ached from the repeated flame charges, and extreme speed still wasn't truly mastered. However, this time, it hadn't been a fluke. I could do it. That alone made my tail twitch happily. Extreme speed was more commonly associated with Arcanine than Braixen. Good. The less my future enemies expected it, the better. By the time I reached our room, I was swaying slightly. Still, I raised a paw victoriously. I beat Umbreon! I barked in Pokémon tongue, making both Jolteon and Noctowl immediately cheer. Then a Ventis-shaped rocket hit me. The girl practically tackled me with medical supplies. Potions, salves, gauze, and bandages scattered across the carpet as she wrapped her arms around me. I am so proud of you. She hugged me tightly. Unfortunately, both of us immediately regretted it. We simultaneously winced and shuddered from the pain traveling through our bond. Ow! We looked at each other, then started laughing. Thanks. I carefully hugged her back. After what was probably an awkwardly long hug, Ventis finally pulled away and got to work patching me up. The potion actually tasted pretty good. The salve, however, remained every bit as minty and painful as always. Whoever invented the stuff had clearly decided healing and suffering should go hand in hand. After my head and arm looked like a caterpie had an artistic venture on them, I fist-bumped Jolteon. Bandage buddies? I snickered. Jolteon bumped his paw against mine. Bandage buddies. Noctowl stared at us from his nest. You two are idiots. That only made us laugh harder. At noon, Terence arrived back from a less successful expedition. He had only managed to find one moon stone this time, but the other things he brought back made me giggle. I was actually educated now, thanks to Ventis's mage books and the library. So when I saw a gemstone bigger than a fist and checked its clarity, I was about 90% sure it could be turned into one of this era's Pokeballs. Thankfully, Terence was no longer the blabbermouth he used to be, and had realized that some discoveries needed to stay secret. Most of his finds were carefully wrapped in cloth before he entered the manor, so only we got to see them. Honestly, I was still unsure how to turn our evolution stones into money. It was just too much. Ventis and I had already decided to gift 2 water stones to the king. It was entirely possible he already knew far more about us than we thought, but it was always better to have the highest seat in the kingdom on your side, rather than against you, no matter how unlikely that conflict might be. The rest? Store them somewhere safe and pretend they didn't exist for now. Geodude and Magmar had also shockingly become friends. It had taken more than a winter, and Terence being an incredibly easy-going master. But even Magmar had eventually admitted that traveling the world and eating good food was preferable to sitting on top of a mountain pretending to be a king. I still wouldn't dare take off his collar. He remained far too wild for that. From the outside looking in, however, the trio was doing surprisingly well. Ventis? A shout came from the balcony above us. I succeeded. Pelliene practically beamed with joy. We bonded, barked Ninetales proudly from beside her. Notably, she wasn't wearing her collar anymore. The funny thing was that the Pokémon had barely changed at all. If anything, she seemed even happier than before, which was frankly impressive considering how cheerful she normally was. To celebrate the occasion, Pelliene ordered the staff to prepare a picnic. Even Terence and his Pokémon were invited. The 3 humans sat beneath a pavilion sipping tea and eating snacks, while the rest of us were provided with an absolutely massive pile of poke cookies. You absolutely have to try this. I shoved a red cookie toward Magmar. The fire duck was in the middle of a conversation when my paw suddenly stuffed the bite-sized treat into his mouth. He glared at me. Then he started chewing. His expression transformed into pure ecstasy. "Oh, this is divine!" he shouted. "Give me more!" Before I could react, he reached forward and stole the entire plate. The traitor. I managed to snatch a few cookies off the pile before he devoured all of my favorite flaming hot snacks. That only made everyone else burst into laughter. The most reserved among us was Delcatty. She carried herself like a noble lady even while eating cookies. Every movement seemed graceful and measured. While the others laughed, argued, or stuffed their faces, Delcatty calmly enjoyed her treats with perfect manners. I didn't bother her. She was simply the quiet type. Leaning back against my tail floof, I looked up at the drifting clouds overhead. For a little while, I almost forgot how harsh this world could be. The warm spring air, the laughter around me, and the sight of friends enjoying themselves made it easy to forget. So I let myself enjoy the moment. With a content smile on my face, I watched the clouds drift lazily across the sky. Open it already. I nudged the scroll with a paw. What if it's bad? It came with your promotion. I was promoted? She asked. I stared at her. She stared at the scroll. Then, with all the courage of a condemned prisoner approaching the gallows, Ventis broke the royal seal. The letter was thankfully short. To Adept Mage Ventis Thorn, your recent achievements have brought great honor to both your patron and the Kingdom of Vermont. It is my belief that exceptional talent should be nurtured and rewarded. As such, I have arranged a marriage between yourself and Robert Balatoa, 6th son of Marquise Romero Balatoa. The young man is of suitable age, respectable character, and possesses sufficient standing to elevate your status while avoiding unnecessary complications. Upon the completion of the marriage, you shall be recognized as a noble by law. Furthermore, I hereby extend a wedding gift. Your tuition, housing, books, and associated expenses at the Royal Magic Academy shall be covered by the Crown. I look forward to witnessing your continued growth and future contributions to Vermont. With high expectations, King Callister Vermont. Ventis read the paragraph. Then she read it again. I watched her eyes slowly widen. Through our bond, I could practically hear gears grinding, and with that, she promptly fainted. I only managed to slide my tail under her head so she would not hit the floor. Honestly, I shook my head. I feel for you. There was no way she could say no to the king after such a letter. Most people would literally faint in joy. Since I was in her head. Nope, it was not joy she fainted over. Cheap move, Your Highness, I muttered as I read the contents all over. When Ventis finally woke, she had a small panic attack. She had plans, yes. Become a grand mage? Maybe. Reach some high places? Hopefully. But marriage into a marquis family arranged by the crown? Well, this was some medieval art, so this was really not out of the game. The news hit Pelliene almost as hard as it hit Ventis. The lovely Master Mage was devastated that she would only have a few more months with her pupil before Ventis left for the Royal Magic Academy to study advanced magic. This was not like the ordinary magic academies scattered across the kingdom where anyone with sufficient talent could enroll. The Royal Magic Academy taught advanced magical theories, war-class spells, magical strategy, and countless other subjects that ordinary mages could only dream of studying. This was where the elite sent their magically gifted children. This was where future archmages, royal advisors, and battlefield legends were forged. On the other side stood Count Alderic, who, while having genuinely grown fond of Ventis, was absolutely delighted that the crown's piercing gaze would finally be lifted from above his head. The man wanted nothing more than to enjoy his hard-earned lands, his EV breeding program, and a life with significantly fewer royal surprises. As for Ventis, she spent most of her days beside the head butler, learning how nobles should eat, walk, speak, sit, and behave in 100 different situations. When to bow, how deeply to bow, who bowed first, which fork to use, how to enter a room, how to leave a room. Apparently, being noble was a full-time occupation. Since she was a learning genius, I wasn't particularly worried, though I occasionally brought her sweets just to improve her increasingly foul mood. Even Terence was not spared. As the first and only subordinate officially serving under Ventis, he was now being taught how a proper servant of a noble should behave. The poor lad barely understood half of it, not because it was difficult, mostly because he spent every lesson thinking about rocks. Several times I caught him staring out a window at a stone wall with the sort of admiration normally reserved for a beautiful woman. Jolteon, Noctowl, and I were also subjected to training. Umbreon had apparently decided that the Pokémon of nobles were expected to conduct themselves in a certain manner within the capital. The moment he attempted to teach me, however, I laughed him out of the room. To demonstrate my point, I spent the next 10 minutes walking, sitting, speaking, and even drinking tea with enough grace and elegance to make half the noble women in the kingdom jealous. Umbreon watched the performance in stunned silence. When I finished with a perfectly executed curtsy, using my tail and fur skirt like an expensive gown, he simply stared. You already knew how to do all that? Of course. How? I smirked. Acting. The dark type looked confused. I merely twirled my wand and grinned. Nobility was nothing more than a play. The clothes were costumes. The titles were props. The etiquette was a script. And unlike most people in this world, I had spent my entire previous life surrounded by movies and such about this whole thing. The bird carried a fancy box in its talons and carefully set it down on Ventis's windowsill. It waited until she opened the window and took the box. Only then did it take off again, disappearing into the sky. I am starting to go insane. Ventis set the mahogany box on the table. It was decorated with gold leaf patterns and even had a few small gemstones embedded into the wood. Definitely something important. If this is another thing designed to make me faint or foam at the mouth, I might just lose my mind. Should I open it and tell you? I asked, honestly expecting some crazy expensive item. Please do. I'll just be over here. She flopped onto her bed with a long exhale. I figured out the latch after a moment, and soon the lid popped open. I gently lifted it, then immediately closed it again. What's in it? A letter, and something you definitely do not want to see, I replied through our mental link. I can't just stay ignorant about things. Ventis groaned and took several long breaths. Tell me in a way that won't give me a migraine. Well, I rolled my eyes. You gave me a migraine with that healing spell booklet, so this is payback. Then, as bluntly as possible, I added, it's a crystal Pokeball, likely with a Pokémon already inside. A what? Ventis shot upright so fast that I was surprised she didn't fall off the bed. I cleared my mental throat just for fun before unfolding the letter. Let's see. Dear Ventis Thorn, as the head of the Magical Institution of Vermont, I have made sure to look into your progress and development in magic. As such, I deemed it necessary for you to be elevated from junior mage to adept, a process which our beloved monarch has already graciously accelerated. In addition, it has come to my attention that you possess not only talent and skill, but also knowledge likely acquired from some mysterious source. I foresee great things in your future and have therefore sent you something that is both a gift and a test. The Pokémon contained within that ball is, by all measures, nasty in temperament and difficult to control, even with a collar. While it will be unable to fight against you, as I have changed the ownership name on the collar specifically to yours, I would still advise against summoning her in front of others before you are capable of controlling her. With sincere interest, Archmage Gahatu Cavellis. Ventis and I both stared at the crystal ball for a long minute. He didn't mention what Pokémon it was, she pouted. Nope. I popped the P as I turned the letter over, checking if there was anything written on the back. There wasn't. Typical. She rolled her eyes and fell back onto her bed. Every story says that archmages are somewhere between crazy and genius. I'm not entirely sure about this one. I would vote for both. I chuckled and poked the crystal ball. Without magic, the Pokémon inside couldn't leave it. Sadly, there wasn't the slightest hint about what might be sealed within. The smooth crystal remained stubbornly silent. Let's just hope there isn't a Gyarados inside, I muttered. That could be a disaster no matter what. For some reason, neither of us felt reassured by that thought. Thinking about not wanting to ruin the place, Ventis and all her Pokémon went out of town to the small area at the forest's edge where we usually battled. The place bore several scars by now. The once proud boulder was now little more than terrain. Jagged rocks, uneven stone, and patches of old melted slag littered the clearing. The nearby trees were either gone or severely damaged from our continuous tests and practice sessions. The grass had long since vanished, either burned away or stomped into the dirt. I am starting to think we are a menace to this patch of land, Noctowl said with a sad look as he glanced around. To be fair, if we ruined the Count's castle, Ventis could have been sent to the pillory as punishment, I whispered. Very unlikely. Jolteon shook his head. At worst, she would have to pay for the repairs. Good to know. I cracked my neck, then turned to Ventis. So, trainer, are you ready? I am still having issues figuring out how to use mana to send out a Pokémon. Give me a second. Ventis slid her bag onto the hillside and drank from her canteen. Pulling out the book she needed, she quickly turned the pages until she found what she was looking for. The magic circle inside the book made my eyes dizzy just looking at it. 3 spiraling circles interlocked with one another, the magic runes forming a complex 3-dimensional setup. Are you sure this is the spell? Seems way too advanced for just a release switch, I muttered while leaning over the book. It was made by an archmage. If it was me, I would. Ventis pulled out a piece of paper and quickly sketched her own version. It contained several modern symbols and looked far less convoluted. There. Well, you can make that after you release the Pokémon and rewrite the enchantment on the ball, I advised. She nodded and shut the book. Through our link, I could feel the knot in her stomach. Honestly, mine wasn't much better. Get ready! She shouted. The 3 of us immediately formed a large circle around her, expecting some monster of a Pokémon. The crystal ball lit up. A loud melodic cry accompanied the light show as the globe released its occupant. The magic wasn't red like a modern Pokeball, but a deep arcane purple that looked far more aggressive than anything from the show. In the middle of the clearing sat a Primarina. She was beautiful, and somehow even more elegant than the ones from the show. Her fur looked immaculate, and she carried herself with the sort of confidence that immediately made me suspicious. Primarina! Pri! She shouted loudly. Then she puffed out her chest. I am the Queen of the Golden Shores. Who dares collar me? My eyes immediately went flat, and I dropped my combat pose. Oh, great. I let out a long sigh. We got a diva. Primarina turned out to be less of a menace and more of a pain in the butt. She continuously fought the collar, and, while she could not hurt Ventis, she was more than happy to blast all three of us with water pumps and surf. This obviously flooded the hillside with water. Mud formed under our feet, and several bushes were flattened by the repeated attacks. Order her to stay still. I am going to wring her neck. I gritted my teeth as my voice snapped at Ventis. I was soaked, in pain, and Primarina kept calling me names. I was so mad that my fur literally steamed, my body temperature spiking high enough that my soggy fur was already drying. You know what? Ventis looked at herself and then at her soaked bag. I have a ton of healing salves. She spoke to me through our mental link. Primarina, I order you to stay still, she shouted. The collar immediately flared and prevented the arrogant water type from dodging. Pri? She started to snap back, only to feel my iron-hard tail slam straight into her lovely face. I did not stop there. Fury swipes. Bite. Several double slaps. A tail smack for good measure. By the time I was done, the previously beautiful Primarina's head looked like a blueberry. Her eyes swirled in circles. Knocked out. I huffed, stood up straight, then turned toward the others with a beaming smile and gave a little twirl. I feel much better. I spoke in such a sugary tone that both Pokémon visibly shivered. I never want to piss her off, Jolteon whispered to Noctowl. The owl immediately nodded. With my work done, Ventis rushed over to the poor sea lion Pokémon with her medical pack. She practically shoved a potion into Primarina's mouth before beginning to inspect the damage. I think you went too far, Fenn. She shook her head while looking at all the bruises already forming. TSK. I turned my head away. Love taps, really. I bet she never had anyone punching her seriously because of her looks. I picked up a dry branch and stuck it into my mouth before continuing in my best old-timey mob boss voice. I simply showed her the pecking order. You did more than just that, Jolteon whispered. Huh? I turned toward him. Jolteon immediately sat down straighter. Nothing, boss. He raised a paw in salute. That same afternoon, when Primarina woke, her head was bandaged so thoroughly that only her eyes could be seen. I was standing over her. You absolute brute of a fire type, she said, her voice muffled behind the wrappings. Her eyes burned with fury. I didn't answer. Instead, I slowly let my claws slide out and made them glow with normal energy. Primarina immediately changed how she looked at me. She slowly swallowed. I decided to push it a little. My master is very nice. She spent an hour making sure your beautiful face wouldn't have a permanent mark. I grinned and forced a bit of arcane energy into my eyes. They glowed faintly purple. Keep up this arrogant act, and I'll make sure not even an archmage can put your face back together. Of course, I wasn't serious, but Primarina didn't have to know that. I had watched enough movies with bad guys to know how to intimidate someone without using Pokémon skills. Primarina nodded swiftly. Satisfied, I backed away and immediately switched to a charming smile and honeyed words. A complete 180. Then, welcome to our team. Since I am the only other female Pokémon here, you may call me Big Sister. I waved and left the room. Primarina waited until the crazy fox was gone before letting out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. Scary. A shiver ran through her body. Looking around, she finally noticed the room she was in. It was lovely. Fancy, even. The scent of flowers drifted in through the open window, carried by a warm spring breeze. Across the room, Noctowl and Jolteon were sleeping peacefully in their usual spots. The bed she was lying on was massive, soft, and smelled faintly of lavender. Even wrapped up like a mummy, she could still smell quite well. Her thoughts drifted backward. She still remembered when some humans had disturbed her favorite spot along the shore. She had made sure they regretted it. Then a massive light had caught her. After that came the tower. A smelly tower. A grumpy, smelly old man. After she tried to fight back and flooded the tower, the light had come again. She didn't know what that strange light was, but every time it appeared, she ended up somewhere else. Now she was here, hurt and hungry, her dignity in shambles. A lump formed in her throat. Before all this, she had been the beloved queen of the Golden Shores. Other Pokémon went out of their way to praise her, bring her gifts, and offer her food. Life had been simple, comfortable. That was now the past. Slowly, she reached up and touched the collar around her neck. Zap! Pain shot through her body. Primarina winced and quickly pulled her paw away. "I am so hungry." Her voice came out small and miserable. With a defeated sigh, she fell back onto the bed and stared at the ceiling. For the first time in a very long while, the Queen of the Golden Shores felt utterly helpless. Honestly, my plan with Ventis worked like a charm. I decided to do the good cop, bad cop routine. I was obviously the bad cop, while Ventis, well, she didn't need to act. She was genuinely a lovely girl. Primarina turned into such a sheepish Pokémon that it was almost funny. She started to adore Ventis. The young mage provided her with sweets, carefully tended to her bruises, and always spoke gently to her. Of course, the water type still twitched every time I came around. I didn't intend to keep up the asshole act forever, but I wanted to make sure the lessons stuck. So whenever she was the only one looking, I would slowly let my claws slide out and give her a wicked grin. The effect was immediate every single time. Sadly, time was not on our side. Weeks turned into months, and before we knew it, the start of the next year at the Royal Magic Academy was right around the corner. With only 10 days remaining and a 5-day journey ahead of us, it was finally time to pack up and head for the capital. "Ventis, take this magic pouch." Pelien handed her a small money pouch, embroidered with silver thread. "This will never give off any sound, and can hold a massive amount of coins without any issues. I made it so you wouldn't have to carry all that heavy coin." Master Pelien fussed over Ventis like a mother hen seeing her chick leave the nest for the first time. Meanwhile, the Count's Machamp loaded crate after crate onto the carriage as though they weighed nothing. Terence ended up with a separate carriage altogether. He had accumulated a surprising amount of belongings over the past months, and there was no way we were leaving all our gems and stones behind. Besides, Magmar weighed about as much as 3 men by himself. The extra space was needed. I didn't like Esther. In fact, I wanted very little to do with her. Still, leaving a hater behind made me uneasy. So I slipped a small note into her room when nobody was looking, just in case. "Dear Esther, while my master and I never really became friends with you, I do not wish to leave with sour thoughts between us. As such, I will give you the biggest gift I can. The rarest of all Eevee evolutions is a fairy-type Pokémon called Sylveon. She is lovely, pink, and adorned with ribbons. Eevee only evolves into Sylveon through love. If you stop focusing on obtaining new Pokémon and instead make sure she can truly love you rather than simply see you as a friend, you may gain the loveliest of Pokémon. My hint is this: take the collar off and tell her that you love her and no other. Best of luck. Fenn." "What was that?" Umbreon asked as I walked back from Esther's room. "Oh, a small gift." I shrugged and adjusted my witch hat. She might not deserve it, but I don't know. I don't like leaving people hating us. "That's surprisingly nice of you." A faint smile appeared on Umbreon's face. "Oh, I can be nice." I offered him a paw. "When I want to." He chuckled softly. I pointed a claw at him. "Keep the Count safe and smile more, you grump. It looks good on you." Umbreon shook his head, but he bumped my paw anyway. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then we looked toward the busy courtyard where servants, Pokémon, and carriages prepared for the journey ahead. The next time we met, things would probably be very different. Neither of us needed to say it aloud. The ride to the capital was long and took us on a totally different route than the one that had brought us here from Hagsrot. Leaving Yvelna behind after a whole year felt weird. I had only spent a few weeks in Hagsrot, so that barely felt like a place I could call home. But the Yvelna Manor? I was going to miss it. Pelien and her Pokémon, especially Ninetales. Umbreon too, the Taskmaster veteran. Still, we were going to the capital, and Ventis was about to get married. I felt a shiver run down my spine. She had only just turned 18, and while younger marriages were common in this era, I still felt that this was too early. Robert Balatoa was a mess. It had been months since the king decided that he would marry an adept mage girl of similar age, but he had never really wanted a wife. He was the type to train his swordsmanship, raise his Pokémon, and read books. Robert was currently sitting under an elm tree in the garden of his family's capital city manor. His hair was tousled, and his cyan noble shirt was stained with dirt and sweat from training. "I really don't want to get married, Bishop." He tossed his wooden sword onto the grass and reached for a towel and some water. "Bish?" His Pokémon shook his head sharply. "Bishop? Yeah, I know. Noble duty and all that. Serve the king and family and all." With a sigh, Robert decided to pour the contents of the jug over his face instead of drinking from it. The cold water ran through his hair and down his neck. It helped clear his tired mind. Sadly, it did not help him find a reason why he could deny the king's order. To my shock, Ventis was not nervous during the travel. Rather, she spent most of her time caring for us. Primarina was finally a fully fledged member of the team. Turns out the diva had a genuinely kind side. She was also pretty strong. Before she evolved, she had apparently been quite the tomboy, beating up other Pokémon for territory and food. Of course, once she evolved, she turned into a pampered, noble-like Pokémon. She was a glass cannon, much like Jolteon had been in the beginning, so we had to work on her defenses. While she was quite slow out of water, in it, she became a completely different enemy. Slippery, fast, and difficult to pin down, she was a true danger. On the second day of travel, we passed over a hill and Ventis almost fell out the carriage window. "Driver!" she shouted. "We will spend the night in this town." She pointed excitedly at the small town coming into view below us beside the road. "But miss, it's only noon. We can make much better distance before we need to find a tavern." The man leaned back from his seat. "I don't care. A few hours do not matter since we started the journey early." Ventis sat back down with a beaming smile. "As you wish, miss." The coachman nodded and guided the carriage toward the only tavern in the small town. "Handle our stay." Ventis handed him a handful of silver pence and signaled for us to follow. Then she practically jumped from the carriage and almost ran toward the other side of town. "Why are we running?" I asked through our link. "This is my hometown," she yelled back at all of us. Noctowl hooted happily. Jolteon jumped in surprise. Primarina blinked several times before hurrying after us curiously. As for me, well, suddenly, stopping the journey made a lot more sense. Ventis slowed as we reached a small shop near the edge of town. Compared to the grand buildings of Yvelna, it looked almost painfully ordinary. The walls were whitewashed, the roof made of weathered red tiles, and a faded sign depicting a spool of thread hung above the door. Several bolts of linen could be seen through the front window, while colourful fabrics hung from a line beneath the awning. "This is it." Ventis stopped. Her voice suddenly sounded much smaller. I looked at the building, then at her, then at the building again. "You are nervous?" I smirked. "No, I'm not." She answered it with a light blush. She was. The girl was practically vibrating. Opening the door to the old tailor shop, there was no one in the front. From the back came the sound of a lovely woman's voice. She walked forward with the casualness of a miltank. She was almost as round as one too. The woman wore a warm smile and had mint blue hair tied into a loose braid. "Coming? What can I help you with?" She slowed down, looking confused at the mage standing in her humble shop. Then her eyes caught the lavender hair. Ventis?" she blurted out. "Hi, Mom," said Ventis, waterworks already flowing freely. The two of them rushed into a hug so tight that even I felt it through our bond. I had to hold back so I wouldn't cry myself. Of course, Primarina behind me had already started crying for all of us Pokémon. If she didn't stop soon, she was going to flood the place. I haven't seen you in 10 years, dear. You've grown up so much. Ventis's mother wiped her eyes with a trembling hand. You did get my letters though, right? Ventis asked, doing much the same. I did. We kept every single one. The lady smiled. And these are your Pokémon? She looked warmly toward us, which finally made Primarina stop bawling her eyes out. Brygson. I gave the lady a thumbs up. The others quickly followed my example and greeted her. Such a lovely collection of Pokémon, she beamed. I can't wait for Bernard to see you. She laughed softly. Soon we learned that she was called Amelia, and obviously Bernard was her husband. What stunned Ventis was the pitter-patter of feet coming from the second floor. Ventis smiled so hard it was infectious. A young boy practically launched himself down the stairs. He had the same red hair as her father and looked to be around 10 years old. Her little brother, Dan. The family spent a long time chatting. Even though they knew most of it from her letters, hearing everything directly from Ventis was different. The fact that she was getting married was still a particularly big topic. So you've never even met this boy? Amelia shook her head. Such a stupid thing to do. What if you two are not? She stopped when Bernard placed a calloused hand on her shoulder. The shepherd had apparently arrived while everyone was talking and now stood beside his wife with a tired but gentle smile. I am sure this is just a political marriage, and if she reaches a high enough position, she may no longer need to stay with the boy. Bernard shrugged. Still, I hope the two of you actually become close. Unwanted marriages never work well. Trust me, Pa, I can handle myself. Ventis winked. By nightfall, all of us were well fed and tired from hours of talking. The food had been simple but delicious, and the warmth of the little home lingered pleasantly in the air. Before we went to sleep, Amelia surprised all of us Pokémon with a small gift, matching blue scarves. Each one had a yellow V stitched into the fabric. Even Primarina became quiet when she received hers. I carefully wrapped mine around my neck and smiled. It was probably the cheapest gift we had received in months. Somehow, it also felt like one of the most valuable. The tavern was quiet after all that talking, and I welcomed sleep. In the morning, Ventis hugged her family once more before we set off. This time, Terence also joined us and introduced himself as Ventis's first servant. That earned him a long talk from Amelia, who wanted to make absolutely sure he kept an eye on her daughter. The boy simply laughed and accepted the quest with a salute. Then we were off. Arriving at the capital was something straight out of a fantasy book. There was a natural semicircle of hills and mountains around the city on one side, while the ocean stretched endlessly on the other. All the creeks and rivers of the area seemed to meet within the massive city itself, feeding into a huge central lake. From there, a single enormous river flowed out toward the sea. The whole place was built from white marble, while most of the roofs were covered with blue tiles. If not for the architecture, I would have sworn it looked like some ancient Greek city with all that blue and white. 4 massive roads led to 4 equally impressive gates. At the gate where we entered, I spotted a Poliwrath and a Feraligator standing beside the soldiers. The 2 Pokémon felt immensely powerful. Still, that was the least interesting thing. I almost fell out the window when we entered the city proper. Evelna had a decent marketplace and some respectable shops, but it paled in comparison to the capital. To begin with, the cobbled roads were wide enough for 4 carriages to ride side by side. The people wore far better clothing than anywhere else I had seen. There was no cheap, uncolored linen in sight. Even the common folk looked well dressed. Pokémon weren't rare here either. I counted at least 17 within a single minute. Well, it definitely looks and smells like a capital should, Ventis chuckled, leaning out beside me. Oh, yeah, I nodded. No smell of waste in the air anywhere. There must be a decent sewer system underneath the city. This is where I was meant to be. Primarina pushed my head down as she beamed at the sights around her. At my growl, she instantly pulled back. Sorry, big sis. I chuckled and swapped places with her so she could get a better view. Judging by the look on her face, she hadn't expected me to be that nice. Still, she happily leaned out of the carriage and began to sing as we passed through the streets. The melodic voice drifted between the marble buildings, gathering no small amount of attention from passers-by. Several people stopped to look, while more than a few Pokémon turned their heads toward the source of the song. Ventis simply smiled and let the melody sway her head from side to side. I had to admit it, the diva was a good singer. Arriving at the small home the king provided for us near the Royal Magic Academy was not what we expected. A home with 2 servants. A maid and a butler waited for us outside. "Are you sure we are at the right spot?" Ventis asked the coachman. "This looks like a noble's home." "I am sure, miss." The man pointed toward the butler, who took long strides toward the carriage and opened the door for her. "Welcome to the capital, adept mage Ventis Thorn." He stepped aside and bowed. "I am Reginald, your butler for now, and I am Zelia, your maid." The woman in a black and white maid outfit gave a deep bow of her own. Poor Ventis was overwhelmed by the 3-story building. It was practically a small manor, complete with a lovely garden full of flowers and neatly trimmed hedges. After unpacking, she was led to her room while Terence and the rest of us were shown to our own quarters. I can get used to this. I immediately jumped into a soft chair. The cushion practically swallowed me whole. Indeed. Primarina slid into the small indoor pool meant for water-type Pokémon and let out a content sigh. I am still as stunned as Master Ventis. Noctowl settled into a corner near a bookshelf. For a long while, she and I only dreamed about accommodations like this. Even Evelna felt like too much in the beginning. "I can vibe with this." Jolteon immediately sprawled across the soft carpet, looking as if he had no intention of moving ever again. "You got your weird words stuck on him too." Noctowl rolled his eyes. I simply laughed. "That's what happens when you spend enough time around greatness." Hoot! The owl's deadpan stare somehow carried more judgment than an entire lecture. Meanwhile, Primarina was floating lazily in the pool, with a blissful expression. "I was born for this lifestyle." "You were born on a beach," I reminded her. "Details," she said, leaning back. The opening ceremony at the academy was still 4 days away, but what really tied a knot into Ventis's stomach was the ceremony happening tomorrow afternoon. The wedding ceremony. Thankfully, there would only be Robert, the priest, and her attending. It was meant to be a very small and personal ceremony. In this age, there were no grand celebrations on the day of the wedding itself. Those happened the day after, which meant the pair would have ample privacy. The celebration was supposedly being planned by the second prince in the palace gardens. Thankfully, Ventis had already met him. That seemed far less frightening than the wedding itself. I arrived at her room carrying a pitcher of fresh lemonade, only to find her unpacking the wedding dress that had been delivered to the house beforehand. The white fabric spilled across the bed, like fresh snow. "Need a moment alone?" I asked gently through our bond. "No," she sighed. "I'd rather have you here. Besides, you already know how I feel." "I do." I hopped onto the bed beside her and looked at the dress. "Well, think of this as a temporary situation. I'm sure we can." "No," she shook her head. "A marriage should be for life." I blinked. "But you don't know the guy." "No matter." Ventis carefully folded part of the dress between her fingers. "I will be someone worthy of his love." She said it with such conviction that it sounded less like a wish and more like a quest she intended to complete. "Oh, Arceus, help me!" I shook my head dramatically. "I will be with you the whole way. And if he turns out to be an asshole, I am going to cook his rump." That earned an actual laugh. Not a small one either. The tension in her shoulders eased, and some of the anxiety faded from our bond. Feeling that I didn't need to say anything more, I leaned forward and nuzzled her cheek. Ventis smiled and scratched behind my ears. For a while, neither of us spoke. The wedding dress rested on the bed between us, waiting for tomorrow. Robert sat on a stone bench in the courtyard of the Balatoa Manor, staring at absolutely nothing. His practice sword rested across his lap. Beside him, Bisharp was polishing one of the blades on his forearm with far more care than Robert was currently giving to his own problems. Tomorrow he would get married. The thought had been circling his head for months, yet now that it was finally here, it somehow felt even less real. He had never met the girl, never spoken to her, didn't even know what her voice sounded like. The sound of footsteps approached. Robert ignored them. The footsteps stopped behind him. Robert continued ignoring them. A hand immediately descended from above, and thoroughly ruined his hair. "What are you doing?" Robert groaned, checking if my little brother is still alive. Rickard Balatoa grinned as he walked around the bench and sat down beside him. The second son of the Marquis looked far too pleased with himself. His brown hair was tied back in a short tail, his noble jacket hung open, and there was a permanent smirk on his face that suggested he was responsible for at least half the headaches in the household. "You looked like someone attending a funeral. I am getting married tomorrow." "Exactly." Robert stared. Rickard grinned. "That wasn't funny." "It was a little funny." The older brother reached over and messed up Robert's hair again. Robert swatted the hand away. "Stop doing that." "No." "Why?" "Because I am your older brother." Rickard nodded as though that explained everything. It probably did. Bishop, traitor that he was, seemed to agree. The steel type even gave a nod. "See?" Rickard pointed. "Both of you are insufferable." "We learned from father." That actually got a snort out of Robert. Rickard's grin softened slightly. "You are worried." Robert looked away. "A little." "A little? Fine. A lot." The admission hung between them. For once, Rickard didn't joke. "You know, most of us thought the king was joking when the letter arrived. That makes me feel so much better." I wasn't finished. The older brother leaned back and looked up at the sky. I asked around. Robert raised an eyebrow. "You what?" I asked around. "About my future wife?" "Obviously." Rickard looked offended. "What kind of brother would I be if I didn't investigate the woman marrying into the family?" "A normal one." "Fair." The older man chuckled. Anyway, the reports were strange. That got Robert's attention. "Strange how?" "Everyone likes her." Robert blinked. "That's it? That is not a normal thing." Rickard pointed dramatically. "Usually, if you ask enough people, somebody complains." Robert couldn't really argue with that. "Apparently, she's smart, hardworking, polite, talented, and somehow managed to impress both the king and the archmage. That sounds suspicious." "I know." Rickard nodded seriously. "It sounds fake." For the first time all day, Robert laughed. A genuine laugh. His brother smiled. "There he is." Robert shook his head. "Thanks. For what?" "For distracting me." Rickard stood up. "That is what older brothers are for." Then he immediately reached down and ruined Robert's hair for a third time. The moment Robert stood to retaliate, Rickard was already jogging away. "Good luck tomorrow." "I hate you." "No, you don't." The shout echoed across the courtyard. Robert sighed and sat back down. Beside him, Bishop made a sound that suspiciously resembled laughter. For the first time in weeks, the knot in Robert's stomach felt a little smaller. With us Pokémon not allowed to join the wedding, I spent the entire morning helping Zelia beautify Ventis. It's not like Ventis wasn't a good-looking girl, but her usual braid had to go. After a proper wash and me using a metal bar and my fire to improvise a curling iron, I managed to stun both Ventis and the maid. Now Ventis wore a high ponytail with a curled end, while several locks framed her face in gentle waves. "What do you even call this technique?" Zelia asked, staring at the result. "It's called a curling iron," Ventis answered for me, though even she seemed stunned by the end result. The usually straight lavender hair that she kept in a loose braid was now transformed into an elegant noblewoman's crown of curls. Zelia worked on her fingernails while I sat on the floor and used a piece of sandstone to smooth out her toenails. When the maid wanted to use facial powder, I immediately pushed it away. Ventis was already pale enough, and I did not trust medieval whitening powders. If anything, her natural beauty was already perfect. Still, when I wasn't looking, the sneaky woman somehow managed to apply a little lip gloss. "Now it's time for you to receive my wedding gift." I pulled a small box from my witch hat. "Wait, how did you hide that in there?" Ventis asked. "A witch does not reveal her secrets." I laughed as she held out her hands. The box itself was nothing special. I had spent only 6 gold back in Evilna on its contents. As soon as she opened it, she gasped. Inside rested a pair of amethyst earrings. The gemstone had been found by Terence, and I had taken it to a jeweler who cut it into matching teardrops. They sat in silver settings, each gem polished and faceted until it caught the light beautifully. I love them. She immediately hugged me. I hugged her back. Then, when the time finally arrived, I walked her to the carriage. I will be with you even there. I pressed her palm against the fluff on my chest. I know, she smiled warmly. Then the carriage door closed. The temple of the capital was grand, with one entire wing dedicated solely to weddings. Ventis was led to a side corridor, and as the bell struck 6, the doors opened. The small wedding hall beyond was beautiful. White marble columns rose toward a painted ceiling, and crystal lamps bathed everything in warm light. Blue ribbons and fresh flowers decorated the altar in the center. Standing before it was a young man, not much taller than Ventis, also looking like a nervous wreck. For a brief moment, the two simply stared at one another. Then Ventis smiled. Taking a slow breath, she gathered her dress and walked toward the altar. Robert Balatoa felt every nerve in his head pulsing. He did not even know what he was expecting. He had seen many noble girls over the years. Some had grown fat from excessive luxury, while others were so skinny they looked like a strong breeze might carry them away. Some were needy. Others shrieked louder than a sparrow whenever something didn't go their way. This girl came from a commoner family, but she was also an adept mage. His mind played all sorts of cruel games on him as he waited at the altar. Then he came face to face with a beauty so stunning that his heart skipped a beat. The girl wore no powder on her face and no visible mascara. Her lavender hair was arranged into gentle curls that framed her face beautifully, and the color itself was so fascinating that Robert could not stop looking at it. If someone had told him she was a princess, he would have accepted it as fact on the spot. The wedding dress his mother had chosen was understated yet elegant, allowing Ventis herself to be the center of attention. Robert swallowed hard and took a step toward the altar. "Hi." He offered a nervous smile and desperately hoped he didn't look like a slowpoke. "I am happy to meet you, Sir Robert." The girl bowed elegantly. "As you may know, I am Ventis Thorn." Robert quickly cleared his throat. "And I am Robert Balatoa." "A pleasure." The priest had to raise the book in his hands to hide his smile. He had been performing wedding ceremonies for longer than he cared to admit, and he had seen every possible combination of bride and groom. Nervous couples. Angry couples. Couples that clearly wished to be anywhere else. This, however, was the first arranged marriage in a very long time where he found himself having high hopes for the pair. The fact that both of them looked equally terrified somehow made it even better. The priest cleared his throat and opened the ceremonial book in his hands. The small wedding hall grew quiet. Even the distant sounds of the capital seemed to fade away. Before Arceus, creator of all things, we gather to witness the union of these two souls. The elderly priest raised his head and looked at the pair standing before him. May the original one bless this bond. May he grant wisdom in times of uncertainty, strength in times of hardship, and joy in times of peace. Robert stood straight, though Ventis could see the tension in his shoulders. Truthfully, she wasn't much better. The priest continued, "Marriage is not merely a promise made during good times, it is a vow carried through storms and sunshine alike." He turned toward Robert. "Robert Balatoa, do you swear before Arceus to stand beside Ventis Thorn in prosperity and in hardship, in health and in sickness, and to remain faithful to her for as long as you both shall live?" Robert swallowed. "I do." The answer came a little faster than he intended. The priest's eyes twinkled slightly before he turned toward Ventis. "Ventis Thorn, do you swear before Arceus to stand beside Robert Balatoa in prosperity and in hardship, in health and in sickness, and to remain faithful to him for as long as you both shall live?" Ventis took a steadying breath. "I do." The nervousness in her stomach somehow eased after saying the words. The priest nodded and reached into a small velvet box, then exchanged the rings. He handed one to Robert and the other to Ventis. Robert carefully took Ventis's hand. His fingers were warm and shaking. Ventis almost laughed. Instead, she gently slid the silver ring onto his finger. A moment later, Robert did the same. Both stared at the rings for a second, as if trying to comprehend that this was now real. The priest closed his book. "Then before Arceus in the kingdom of Vermont, I declare you husband and wife." A smile spread across the old man's face. "You may seal your vows." The pair immediately looked at one another. Ventis blinked. Robert blinked. The priest suddenly became very interested in the ceiling. A long moment passed. "Oh, for the love of—" I muttered from the back of her mind. Ventis's face turned pink. Robert's turned red. Finally, both leaned forward at exactly the same speed, hesitated halfway, then continued anyway. The kiss barely lasted more than a second. When they pulled apart, both looked equally embarrassed. The priest let out a satisfied hum. Wonderful. Neither newlywed looked convinced. Still, the rings were on their fingers. The vows had been spoken. And before Arceus himself, Robert Balatoa and Ventis Balatoa Thorn were now husband and wife. Back home, I waited for Ventis to arrive. Sadly, she had to stay behind and get her papers updated. Now she had 2 family names, like every noble woman. Of course, she could have chosen to drop her old family name, as it would not carry further down the line, but the law allowed her to keep it on her papers. Honestly, I felt the same way. Keeping it was a good thing, even if it wasn't a noble lineage. I would ask how you are, but I was in your head the whole time. I chuckled. She smiled, honestly looking as though a boulder had been lifted from her shoulders. "I think we might need a strong tea," she stated. Only then did I notice she had not come alone. Robert Balatoa was standing up from his seat just behind her. Oh, Casanova also came. I spoke in Pokémon tongue and took a step back. Oh my! Robert nearly jumped out of the carriage. That is abrasion. His eyes widened. How? No, don't tell me. He rubbed his forehead and suddenly looked as though several pieces had fallen into place. Now I understand why the king was so adamant. He pointed toward me. This changes a lot. I was told that she is rare, but is she that rare? Ventis asked, sounding surprised. It's not just about rarity. Well, partly. Robert let out a nervous laugh. But the Fennekin line is well known as the exclusive Pokémon line of the Zhaoshara royal family. Apparently, they guard the species so fiercely that anyone caught stealing one loses their head. He paused. Oh, a helpless grin appeared on his face. This is about to turn into a political water bomb. That's not funny. Ventis gave him a serious look. I am only laughing at how ridiculous this situation is. Robert raised both hands defensively. Then his expression softened. Well, regardless of that, I will protect you from all of it. Ventis blinked. Not only because the king expects me to, he hesitated for half a second, but because you are my lovely wife. The words left his mouth before he could stop them. Robert immediately turned red as an apple. Ventis turned pink. The silence became painful. He has my seal of approval. I spoke directly into Ventis's head. Then I wisely turned around and headed for the kitchen. Some battles were best left to the newlyweds. Besides, the tea was not going to make itself. Robert turned out to be this era's version of an otaku. He rarely left home, read an absurd amount of books, and spent most of his free time training with his Pokémon. He hated social gatherings, even if he had to attend them because of his family, and nobody had really expected him to get married. Well, anyone who placed bets against him getting married must be feeling quite foolish now, I joked toward Ventis. I would like some privacy now. Ventis promptly shut down the connection. Humph. I rolled my eyes downstairs in the Pokémon room. What happened? Asked Jolteon. Ventis shut me out. I shrugged and handed Primarina a berry drink. Thanks. She nodded happily. You told me about this bond, but not exactly what it is. How does it work? She flopped her tail lazily out of the water. It's a soul bond, meaning if either of us dies, the other dies too. We can talk in our heads and share each other's pain and emotions. I explained it casually. Primarina nearly dropped her drink. You are crazy that you accepted that. She shook her head. Well, either that or she would have ended up comatose. We both saved each other's lives in the beginning, so it made sense. I shrugged and placed the fruit bowl in front of Jolteon and Noctowl. Also, since when are you this nice? It's creepy. Primarina looked genuinely suspicious. I slowly turned toward her. You want me to return to my savage form? A sadistic smile spread across my face. Nope. Primarina straightened instantly. Nice Fenn is the best. She grinned nervously. Thought so. I picked up my own fruity drink and took a sip. I miss cooking, but I tried to balance out the fruits so the taste would have some harmony. The others exchanged glances before trying theirs. A moment later, all three spoke at once. "It's good." I leaned back proudly. The party in the royal palace gardens was the complete reverse of the wedding. The wedding had been quiet. This was chaos. Every young noble under 25 seemed to have been invited. The youngest were around 12, though many of them acted like they were already seasoned politicians and war heroes. The palace gardens themselves were beautiful. White stone paths wound between flower beds and fountains. Small streams crossed the grounds through carved channels, while lanterns hung from trees despite the sun still being high. Musicians played from a raised pavilion, filling the air with pleasant melodies. Prince Augustine Vermont personally welcomed the guests. The second prince congratulated both Robert and Ventis, shook their hands, and then officially opened the celebration. After that, the flood began. Nobles. So many nobles. I sat beside Primarina near one of the refreshment tables while Ventis and Robert were forced into conversation after conversation. At least 30 guests attended. There were nearly as many Pokémon. Absol stood elegantly beside one noble girl, looking as though the entire event was slightly beneath him. A Hatena sat on a chair near a fountain and continuously looked annoyed. Meanwhile, a Petalil wore an actual flower crown and acted as though she owned the entire garden. "I already miss Yvelna," I muttered. "No kidding," Jolteon agreed. The smiles were what bothered me. Not all of them. Prince Augustine's smile was genuine. Robert's brother Rickard was laughing loudly with a group of young nobles and seemed genuine enough too. But over half the people here? Completely fake. Their smiles never reached their eyes. Their compliments felt rehearsed. Their laughter arrived half a second too late. It reminded me of office politics, only with prettier clothing. "You are staring." Primarina nudged me. "I know. You look like you want to bite somebody." "I know." She scooted slightly away. "Smart girl." Across the garden, Ventis was currently speaking with a group of noble daughters. She smiled politely. They smiled politely. The entire thing felt like watching three Meowths circling the same fish. "Oh, you are the adept mage." "Oh, you are the one with the Braixen." Neither sentence was actually spoken. Somehow they still managed to say them. Robert appeared beside Ventis a few moments later, seemingly sensing her discomfort. The noble girls immediately became much friendlier. I rolled my eyes. Ugh, noble brats. Noctowl nodded from his perch in a nearby tree. At least Bishop remained normal. Robert's steel type stood beside the refreshments looking deeply uncomfortable. I walked over and sat beside him. Hate these fake parties? From the bottom of my heart. Same? The dark steel warrior looked relieved. Finally, someone sensible. Behind us, Primarina had somehow gathered an audience and was singing. The diva was absolutely thriving. Meanwhile, Ventis and Robert continued surviving the endless sea of noble conversations. To my surprise, Robert quietly moved closer whenever somebody tried to put Ventis on the spot.